In this video, we're going to install Virtualmin, which is a web hosting control panel. It's available in both an open source free version and a professional version, which costs a little money and includes support and a few additional features. We're going to install it today on a Vultr virtual machine. Vultr is one of several quite good virtual machine providers. There's a whole bunch of them. DigitalOcean is one, Linode is one, Scaleway is another. There's a bunch of others that I'm not thinking of at the moment. They are all quite low priced, and their service is pretty good, pretty reliable, pretty fast. We use Vultr for some of our mirrors, and we use Scaleway for some of our mirrors. We've got Linode instances. We have a variety of instances, and we like them all. So this is not really an endorsement of Vultr, but we like Vultr, and if you want to follow along, you can create a Vultr account, and you can pause this and then come back. And now we're going to click this Deploy New Server. I already have an account set up, and I'm going to click Deploy New Server. And you can choose where you want to put it. You'd want to pick one that's near where you live or where your customers live. It will affect latency a little bit. I'm in Texas, so I'm going to pick Dallas. But it doesn't really matter a lot. Anything that's on the same continent as your users is going to be fine. I'm going to pick CentOS, 64-bit, CentOS 7, just because that's the most commonly used distribution for our customers. But Virtualmin also supports Debian, and it supports Ubuntu. We support only the LTS versions of Ubuntu, so keep that in mind. Right now we support 14.04 and 16.04, with 18.04 coming pretty soon. And for Debian, we support 7, 8, and 9. They have servers in sizes starting at $2.50 a month on up to $640 a month for a really huge server. They are sold out of the $250. That's all right. We're going to pick the $5 one, which has a gig of memory and a 25 gig SSD. That is probably sufficient for most website focused sort of things. If you wanted to do mail, you'd probably want more than that, because the virus scanning and the spam filtering are both pretty heavyweight processes. So you'd want to go look at one of these bigger instances if you're going to be processing a lot of mail. But we'll just, for this demonstration purposes, we'll pick this 1 gigabyte instance. And then if we wanted to use this in production, we'd probably want to choose Enable Auto Backups, because it's only $1 extra a month, and that would be a nice little bit of extra assurance that you've got backups. You'd still want to use the Virtualmin backup features, but yeah, since this is just a demo, I'm going to skip that. If you have set up SSH keys, you would want to include those. I am doing this demonstration on a Windows laptop that doesn't actually have any of my keys. I usually use a Linux system to manage all of my servers, and it has keys, and that's what this is. If you added all your keys, you'd be able to log into your new server without having to know a password. Really important step, and we can set it, you can set it later, but for me it's really nice to start from the get-go and give it a name and a label so that I can find it very easily in the list of servers that I have. And then when Virtualmin is installing, there will already be a host name for this system. And that's important for Virtualmin because it will configure things like postfix with the domain name. It will configure your default NS records with the domain name. So it's really useful to have that. Pick a fully qualified domain name. And that means anything like virtualmin.com or demo.virtualmin.com. Just saying Virtualmin would not be a fully qualified domain name. You need the top level domain, you need the second level domain, and then you need whatever other names you want to put on there. And now this doesn't need to be the name of any websites that you'll be hosting on the server, and in fact it probably shouldn't be. It should probably be something that is generic for just to generically refer to this specific server rather than any domain names you'll be hosting the websites for on that. So like I wouldn't choose www.virtualmin.com. I might choose something like serve1.virtualmin.com or server1 or main and secondary or main and backup or whatever. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click Deploy Now to start this process. And this will take a moment. So while it is installing that, I will talk about the next step. And the next step will be to log into this server using SSH. And because I'm on Windows, I don't have an SSH client by default. You would need to install one. If we were in Linux, we would just open a terminal and start that and just type in SSH lroot blah, blah, blah. Likewise on Mac OS X, you can just open a terminal and type SSH. But because we don't have that, we're going to have to install one. A very popular one is called PuTTY, and that is probably the simplest option. You just go and download it. It's a small download. You can put it on a USB key and carry it with you everywhere if you want to. But in my case, I'm going to use Git because it includes a sort of minimal GNU environment. It includes Bash, which is a very nice shell from the Unix world, and it includes OpenSSH and the SSH client. It also includes Git, but we're not going to be using Git in this example. I've already installed that because I have a pretty slow network link, and I don't want to make you wait around for me to install things. And if this is done, and it is, I'm going to click on Manage. And then I'm going to open up one of my, and it's just called Get Bash in the Start menu. And so I've started that up, and now I want to SSH-L root. So that means login name will be root. And I'm going to copy this IP address. And I'm going to copy that password. And I say yes, this is accepting the certificate for this server so that my SSH client will recognize it in the future. There we go. So we're logged in now, and we can see that we have roughly 1 GB of memory, and we have roughly 25 GB of storage. And now we can download Virtualmin. And I already have the download page pulled up over here. You can just go to virtualmin.com and click on the download link in the menu. And this has very simple instructions for doing the installation, which is what we're doing now. It suggests you check for the supported operating system, which we chose CentOS 7. That's a grade A supported operating system. It suggests you have a fully qualified domain name, which we've already done. We gave it demo.virtualmin.com. Those are the 2 big important first steps. And then we want to download the install script. And we could go and buy Virtualmin Pro and download it, but for this demonstration, we're just going to use Virtualmin GPL. And here's a command you can copy and paste to use to download it. And now I have that, and I'm going to run it just like it says to do over here. You can copy and paste this command if you want to. I'm already root, so I don't actually need that sudo. I'll paste that here. And I'm going to run it with the help option, just so I can go through briefly what the options are if you wanted to do some kind of custom installation different than the defaults. And so we have uninstall, which will remove all the Virtualmin packages and all the packages that the installer does. You don't want to use this on a production system because it's very, very destructive. But if you were scripting with this installer and you wanted to see how it worked and then uninstall it and then try it again, you could do that. So if you were setting up with a Chef or Puppet recipe or something and you wanted to do some test installs. Then you have help, which prints this message. You have force, again, for scripting this thing, it will skip all confirmation messages and it will just say yes to all of the questions that it asks. So make sure you understand what all the questions it's going to ask are, and know that make sure you know that that answering yes is going to be the right thing. Using the hostname flag sets the fully qualified hostname. If we didn't already have the hostname set, we could set it as part of the install process by specifying it here. And that would fill in the variable and use it wherever it needs a hostname later in the install process. Verbose causes it to log to the console a little bit more verbosely, tells you a little bit more, provides debug logs. Might be useful for troubleshooting if you have a problem. But you can also see all of the verbose logs by looking in the Virtualmin install log during or after the installation. Setup will just set up the software repositories that we provide and then exit. It does not do any installation or configuration. You would use that if you wanted a very, very customized installation where you just wanted to install our packages and then pick and choose what steps of the configuration you wanted to do. Minimal will leave out some of the very large packages, in particular ClamAV and Spam Assassin, as well as some additional ancillary packages that aren't super necessary. Some of the analytics packages and stuff like that will get left out. So it results in a slightly smaller install footprint and quite a bit smaller memory usage. So if you're on a very small system, which we're kind of borderline, this is a 1 GB system. That's about the borderline of what we would consider a very small system. Anything below that, you would definitely want to run a minimal install on. Anything above that, you get to choose whether if you're going to be accepting mail or not, you can choose whether you want minimal or not. Bundle determines which installation bundle to use, and a bundle is just the package set that gets installed and configured. And right now, this is choosing between LAMP, which is an Apache-based stack, and LEMP, which is an Nginx-based stack. And if you're not sure which to choose, if you don't really know you want Nginx in particular, choose the LAMP stack. Just leave it at its default. LAMP is more featureful. It does more. It is a little bit better supported. Certainly, you're going to find a lot more documentation about the Apache-based stack. So you give up a few features. The benefits to the Nginx stack are that it uses a little less memory and is maybe a little faster on a very small system. On a bigger system, you're not really going to see much difference. Again, unless memory is a major constraint, Apache is probably the best bet. Certainly if you're a beginner, you're just going to find a lot more documentation about Apache. Disable feature name, that would disable some features. This is a new feature that you probably don't want to mess with just yet. It allows you to leave out some of the features of the installer. Okay, let's go ahead and run it. And I'm just going to run it with no options. The host name is already set. I am going to, for this demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and install the full stack. I'm going to install the LAMP stack. Okay, so the installer checked for the things that it really needs to get started, and it found that Perl was not installed, so it's going to install that for us. And if this takes a long time, I'll pause and then restart the video after it's finished. It can take a while because it has to download packages. Okay, that finished, so now we have Perl. And this is telling us the version, and it reminds us what supported operating systems are. And then it tells us what kind of installation we're doing, and that it's a full installation. It tells us about how much disk space it's going to require. And we're going to say, yeah. Okay, so this says we have less than a gigabyte of RAM. It says we have less than 1024 megabytes, which is a little small. Particularly on an apt-get system, it could run out of memory just because apt-get grows very large when installing a large list of packages. So it's going to offer to create us a swap file, and we're going to let it do that for us because that'll give us a little breathing room and there won't be any risk of apt or other processes getting killed by the out-of-memory killer. All right, so that's creating the swap file, and that's done, and now it's going to start the installation. We could check on the install if we wanted to by opening another terminal and looking at the Virtualmin install log. I'm not going to do that. Only reason to do that would be to see if something were going to go wrong or we were worried about it. Oh, I messed up our output here. But so I'll talk about what's happening as it's happening. The first step, the first phase, 1 of 3, is the setup. As I mentioned, that just sets up our software repositories, the Virtualmin CentOS repository and the Virtualmin Universal repository. Those are the packages we provide, including things like jailkit on CentOS and procmail wrapper and a few other binary builds, a custom Apache that works with the way we set up SUEXEC, and then also all of our pure Perl and architecture independent packages that are Webmin, Usermin, Virtualmin, and all of its related plugins. There's a couple dozen, modules for Webmin that go into making a Virtualmin system. All of those things are found in our repositories, and that's what that sets up. And then we download and set up EPEL, which is the enterprise additional packages that are provided by the Fedora community. And we use a few packages out of that. We use ProFTPD out of that, and probably a couple of others. And then we enable the extras repository, which provides, I don't remember what packages we pull out of that, but we need that for some additional functionality. And then we enable the software collections library utilities, which allows you to install and configure packages out of the software collections library, which is where we get PHP 7 and where you could also get, if you wanted newer versions of things like MariaDB, which is the database that is used on CentOS 7. And you could install a newer Perl version, newer Python version, probably newer Ruby versions, a variety of things like that. We just get PHP 7 from that. And at this stage, we're installing all the dependencies and system packages. And we do that on Yum-based systems on CentOS by using a Yum group that we provide from our repository. And it is we actually have a LAMP stack and then the Virtualmin core groups. These are Yum groups that can be modified if you wanted to provide your own, like custom sort of deployment. If you were deploying to 1,000 servers and you wanted them to have a very custom setup, you could create your own Yum groups to do that and provide additional things. And you could stack that on top of what we do. And that's very, very easy to do and very, very easy to script with something like Chef or Puppet or Salt or whatever configuration management system you use. And now we're on to phase 3, which is the configuration phase. Here we use a relatively new tool that we introduced in Virtualmin 6. That is a very basic configuration management system designed to work with Webmin and Virtualmin called Virtualmin Config. And that is open source, and you can see it and work on it yourself if you want to fork it and do a custom version. And it is plugin based, so it's very easy to add additional configuration. And you can see some of the configuration plugins that are happening right now, AW Stats and Apache and Bind and what have you. And you have access to that command later after installation. It is available under the Virtualmin command. The subcommand is config system. And so you can run any of the additional plugins later. So if you wanted to set up PostgreSQL after installation, you could do that using that config system plugin. And I'll do an additional video in a few days covering what all you can do after installation with the Virtualmin config plugin. Okay, so we're up and running. And I have not added demo.virtualmin.com to our DNS zone, so I'm going to go and use the IP address. But this ordinarily, if this domain were a working functional domain name, we'd be able to just log in with this suggested address. But I'm going to grab the IP address, and I'm going to go over here to a session that I've got open, and I'll just paste that in there, and I'll send it to port 10,000. And I need to make it an HTTPS request because we do run over SSL/TLS by default. Okay, and we get a warning that this is not secure because it's an invalid security certificate. This is a self-signed certificate. We'll talk about in another video how to get a Let's Encrypt certificate. But for now, we're just going to confirm this security exception. We're going to say, okay, let us log in anyway. And forgive my slow connection. I'm on a mobile wireless connection, so it's a little slow sometimes. All right, and I log in with root and that password that I had. And if you don't have a root password set, but you do have an administrative user set, you can also use that user to log into Webmin, which means that if you have any users that have sudo all privileges in the sudoers file, you will have access to Webmin as root using that user. Okay, we're logged in. I'm going to make this bigger because it's really small. Okay, so now we're going to run through the post installation wizard. This is Virtualmin asking you a few questions about what you'll be using your system for and about how you want to prioritize memory usage. And I'm going to allow notifications. This allows Virtualmin to tell me about things on the system, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But so we'll just go through this and walk through it and talk about the steps and what these questions mean. So we have preload Virtualmin libraries. This will make the Virtualmin user interface faster. This will not affect anything other than the Virtualmin user interface. This is not about Apache or anything that Virtualmin manages. But if you have a lot of users, or you'll be using the Virtualmin user interface heavily, and you have memory to spare, you'll want to set that to yes. That allows the Webmin app server to preload all of the Virtualmin libraries. The email domain lookup server. This is another Virtualmin process that keeps up with metadata about the user and what their configuration is. For example, if they're using spam filtering and antivirus filtering, proc mail, etc. If they have any mail forwarders or autoresponders or anything like that, this makes those processes faster. If we were accepting mail on this server, we would want to do that. Certainly if we were accepting mail for a lot of users. But we're not. This is a small server, so I'm gonna leave that one off. Next up is the ClamAV server. This is ClamD. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a really big process. It grows extremely large. If we were to set this to yes, it would take an additional 600 or so meg of our memory. We're not going to do that. We don't have a lot of memory to spare. But if we were receiving mail, a lot of it, and we wanted it to be fast, and we wanted to scan for viruses, we would want to run that ClamAV server. We're going to skip that. Spam Assassin, same story, takes a little more memory. And if we were receiving mail, we'd want to leave that on, or we'd want to turn that on. This lets us choose which databases to run. If Postgres was not installed, this wouldn't show up, but MySQL is the most commonly used, very, very popular server, database server. PostgreSQL is not worse, it's just different, and it is much less widely used. If we had a lot of memory and we wanted to use PostgreSQL, we would probably do that. We'd turn that on. So you almost certainly want MySQL. You may or may not want Postgres. Okay, we need to set a root password for MySQL. This is really important for security. It would be dangerous to leave MySQL exposed without a root password. We can also choose to remove the test MySQL database and the anonymous MySQL user. And then this allows us to choose the size of the MySQL configuration. If you've ever manually installed MySQL or MariaDB, you know that there are example configuration files that have various sizes of cache and buffer set up, which dictates how much memory the MySQL process will use. Usually you can just let it go with the default. If memory were at a premium, we'd want something smaller, and Virtualmin will detect that and make a suggestion. If this were a smaller system, Virtualmin would have selected this, or if it were a big system, Virtualmin would have selected this. So it's usually safe to leave this as the default. Okay, this sets the names that will be used in NS records in Virtualmin, and it defaults to setting the primary name server as the host name of the system itself, which makes sense. That makes sense to be the primary name server, especially if you have a small setup with only 1 or 2 servers. And then this should be whatever your other name server names will be. And you should have at least 2. And the more the better. So I'm going to go ahead and configure my name servers here. If you're hosting your name service with someone else, with something other than your own server, you could also fill those in here. You're kind of signing up for a lot more work if you don't let Virtualmin manage your domain name servers. And you can, if you plan to create some additional name servers, you could go ahead and fill those in here with the names that you're going to be using. And then you can create them later as slaves of this server. And I'll do a video later about how to set up a domain name server slave. That's covered in our Webmin documentation as well. I think there's a Virtualmin document about it as well. And I'm going to choose to skip check for resolvability because I know this is not in our zone yet. And it would just give an error if it couldn't resolve it. Okay, and this one's a security question. You can let Virtualmin store its domain name account passwords in plain text or hashed. Hashed are more secure. However, you trade off some convenience for that. If you use hashed passwords, your users won't be able to recover their passwords without resetting them. It'll force a back and forth to reset. And it will also have to use different passwords for MySQL databases, database users, because Virtualmin won't know the password for your domain accounts because it's not storing them; it's storing them as a hashed password. Okay, so the only real risk of storing plain text passwords is if your users use the same passwords. If they reuse passwords, that becomes very dangerous. Otherwise, realistically, if someone has root on your server and that's the only way they would be able to see the plain text passwords, that's the big risk. But if they have root, they already own the server and they own everything on the server. So it's kind of a wash as to how dangerous plain text passwords are for that in that instance. But this does protect your users against if they've reused passwords. This protects them against that. So we're going to go with hash passwords. Okay. Now we're complete. We could go through and look at features and plugins if we wanted to. That allows you to disable some features. For example, I didn't want to do virus and spam filtering on this server because it's a quite small server. So I would just disable those, and now it won't bother checking those. And so I saved that. And since I made changes, it's going back to that. We don't want to do that. We can do our recheck configuration now. That would be the next step. That's actually a bug that it took us back there. That's interesting. Okay, so we recheck configuration. And this is just Virtualmin making sure everything is reasonable for what it expects. Checks the PHP versions that are installed. Looks to see if it has the chroot jailkit commands. Looks to see what IP addresses we have. Sometimes you might get a warning about this if this doesn't match the public address for the server. On some virtual machine providers, you'll see that happen where you have a private address and then there's a public address that's not the same, and you'll have to configure Virtualmin to know about that. Sometimes it can detect it, sometimes it needs to be configured manually. Okay, and so now we could start creating virtual servers, but I'm not going to go into that in this video. Let's see how long we're going. Getting a little long here, so I'm going to quickly go over some other things you might want to change if you were wanting to have account plans, some different types of, like if you were selling hosting and you wanted to have a big plan and a little plan and a middle plan, you could create plans here that have the sizes, which are just basic limits. You could edit your server templates, which determines a variety of settings. Tons of options here. It's really probably useful for you to explore this if you want to see all the things that Virtualmin can customize. Virtualmin is by far the most flexible and customizable control panel out there. Can be a little intimidating because it is so customizable. You can choose one thing that people commonly change, and it's possible that we'll eventually change this to be the default, which is the format for usernames. This one, I like username.domain, but many users change it to username@domain because it's a little more intuitive for non-technical users to just fill in their name. Mine would be joe@virtualmin.com. This has a few caveats. Some software won't work with that. We work around all the software that we install. We provide, certainly all of our software supports it, and all of the things that we install and set up get configured to work appropriately with that. But you might find that some other mail processing software or webmail clients or whatever won't work with that username. So it's worth knowing about that. And it's also worth knowing that it creates two users, a user@domain user and a user.domain user, when you use that format. So you'll end up, it'll look a little strange if you look in your password file or your postfix virtual file, virtual maps file. Another thing to explore, and I won't go into any detail in this because it's already a quite long video, but you can look at the Virtualmin configuration. There's tons of online help here. This can tell you a lot about all the things that are configurable and all the things that Virtualmin can do. By default, it's a pretty basic setup, but you can enable a lot of additional features, and you can customize how it looks, how much information gets shown when you're looking, at your list of domains or whatever. Yeah, so at this point, we'll just head back to the dashboard, and I'll mention one more thing before we exit, and that is that Virtualmin now has notifications, and these will pop up. You couldn't see it earlier when I enabled notifications, when I allowed notifications over here, but this actually popped up on my desktop. And so it told me that we had package updates, and we push package updates pretty hard. We're gonna show you that you have package updates all over the place in the user interface because it's super important that you run up-to-date software on a world-facing server. And so I'm gonna go ahead and start that install or those updates, and you can do all this in the UI. You never have to hit the command line if you don't want to. But yeah, we're gonna call this video done because it's already very long. Let me know in the comments if I've left anything out, if anything was confusing, if I went too fast or too slow. If there's anything else you want me to cover in a video, let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe if you want us to do more videos like this. Yeah. So again, thank you for watching.